Hello, Brain Damage Philosopher here, and I hope I'm finally getting the hang of how far to hold the microphone away from my face so it doesn't get uh, get too loud and start clipping at the top end. Anyway, so when I made my original secular morality video, not part of my eudaimonistic egoism series of lectures, but the standalone one that's meant to be a more general introduction to my approach to ethics, since my specific ethical system is incredibly baroque and has a lot of moving parts. Um, I when I originally made it, I sort of resigned myself to it probably turning into a series that would parallel the eudaimonistic egoism series. But I was hoping I could put off releasing another video in this burgeoning series until I'd completed my counter-apologetics playlist. However, now that the counter-apologetics playlist is beginning to wind down with my exploration of merely some of the particular theological problems with Christianity, and I've begun, considering where else I might want to work within my, philosophical landscape on this channel, I've found it sort of difficult to put aside thoughts of that secular morality series. And since the purpose of this channel is really just to get philosophical thoughts off my mind before I forget them or they drive me crazy, and find a way to express them as best I can, I figured since this secular morality series is on my mind, I might as well release another video. So here's that video. So in this video, I'm going to go into more detail on the meta-ethics of my system of secular morality and explain what exact claims I'm making about it and what claims I'm not making about it. A lot of this actually stems from my call with Shannon Q on the line, which you can find, although I don't particularly recommend it since I wasn't great on my feet and it wasn't a very good call overall. I mean, you can look it up if you want, but whatever. Anyway, so yeah, the first thing to point out is that a lot of people seem to confuse absolute morality, universal morality, and objective morality. Generally because when a religious person claims to have an objective moral system, and this is also true for most ethical philosophers as well, they generally also claim it to be universal and absolute implicitly. But let me draw the distinction here. A universal morality is one that applies to all actors which are capable of making moral decisions. An absolute morality is one that tells you to do the same thing or act by the same principle in all situations. And then an objective system of morality is one that applies to someone whether or not they actually believe or admit that it does. So let me draw an analogy. Gravity is an objective thing because it applies to you whether or not you think it does. It's a fact independent from feeling or opinion. However, gravity is not universal. There are technically no places where gravity does not affect you, but there are many places where the effect is basically non-existent. For instance, in the vacuum of space, or at Lagrange points. Gravity is also not absolute because it changes its direction and how much it pulls and some of the different things that it does depending on where you are as well. In a similar fashion, I think it's valid to say that a system of morality is objective for those that it applies to, while also not being universal or absolute. Moreover, I think that this is not trivial either. For comparison, take Matt Dillahunty's moral system, and I'm not just picking on him, I'm actually a huge fan of him and think his moral system is reasonable as far as it goes. But for Matt Dillahunty, you have to choose the goal of maximizing overall well-being, and that choice is itself arbitrary and subjective, although he rightly thinks that most people would choose it if they give it a lot of enough thought. Obviously, once you've selected the goal, then hypothetical imperatives relative to that goal can become assertoric, and you can determine things objectively. But the selection of the goal is subjective and arbitrary. However, if you have a moral system which is objective, in my moral system, which I claim is objective, I believe that given a person who desires their own well-being, which I believe is everyone, and given a person whose well-being is related to the well-being of others and how they treat others, the goal of having having sort of a consequentialism with side constraints relative to the well-being of others becomes objective in their case, because it is actually something that they care about and should, based on the desires that they do have and can't avoid having, pursue. So it's independent of their feelings or opinions on the matter. It's just an objective ought for them, because they do have a desire, and there are some things that will increase the satisfaction of that desire and some that won't, objectively speaking. However, this is not a universal ethic, because there are people who are perhaps extremely depressed who may not desire their own well-being, although I think this is dubious. And there are also people who are psychopaths whose well-being is not tied up in the well-being of others. At least not, and how they treat others, at least not inherently. And so, however, I still think that my moral system is in a slightly better position than one that's based on something that's purely subjective and arbitrary. Because even for Matt, under his moral system, his choice, for anyone that accepts Matt's moral system, no matter who they are, none of them can view it as objective, because it's just a subjective and arbitrary choice to make that their moral goal. Whereas for my moral system, for the people that it does apply to, it is objective. And yes, it may not apply to everyone, but that doesn't make it subjective, just as certain health requirements don't apply to everyone, but are objective for that person. Like, for instance, having diabetes. That's not something that everyone has, but it's objectively true that some people have it, and for those people, they have to do certain things because of that. So that's why it's possible for something to be objective but not universal. And yes, I agree, having a universal objective morality would be far better, but I don't think that's possible. In fact, I think that up until deontology, I don't think any moral system ever claimed to be universal, even while it was claiming to be objective. For instance, natural law admitted that the specific moral requirements might differ between different species. The only reason it thought natural law philosophers thought natural law applied to the whole human race was because they thought the whole human race was more similar than they realized. Furthermore, even if my moral system isn't universal, that doesn't mean it breaks down when a person who's motivated by my moral system interacts with someone who isn't. Because the person that's motivated by my moral system can morally, because they are motivated by my moral system or operate within it, prevent, for instance, psychopaths from hurting others, even though the moral system of the psychopaths isn't saying they're doing anything wrong. Because you being able to morally react with your moral system to someone else has nothing to do with whether, according to their moral system, they're doing anything wrong. It has to do with whether your moral system assesses that they're doing something wrong. Something that's unjust according to your own system of how people should be treated, or according to your consequentialist component of morality, and so on, right? Like, what the only limiting factor on how you should treat people based on the moral system that's assertoric in your case is simply how much your well-being is affected by how you treat others. So and that is obviously affected by how the person you're dealing with treats others and what they're doing. And so the objective moral system, my moral system, if you're working within it, the psychopath might not be doing anything wrong by their moral system. You might not be able to say to them that they should or should not do something. But my moral system can tell you that it wouldn't hurt your well-being to stop them. It can tell you that you're perhaps even morally obligated to stop them. So that's the universal or non-universal component of my ethics or my moral system. I think that the fact that it's not universal isn't really a problem for it. Now, moving on to the absolute side of things, I don't think a moral system is invalid simply because its dictates change depending on the context around you. This was the strongest and most active objection that Shan and Q launched against my moral system was that, for instance, in a society, for instance, Nazi Germany or whatever, that punishes you for doing good things and rewards you for doing bad things, my moral system might, since it's all about your well-being, tell you to do bad things and avoid doing good things. However, here's the thing. What you're forgetting in that case is two things. First, my moral system takes into account, of course, changes in well-being imposed from the outside, but it also takes into account your conscience, right? The way in which your well-being is tied up in the well-being of others. So my moral system wants you to try to maximize both if possible, and if that's not possible and they become contradictory, to run a multivariate optimization calculation, right? And so my moral system would probably say that try to find a compromise between your continued existence and welfare and your conscience. So maybe, don't go demonstrating out in the streets in the middle of Soviet Russia against Stalin, right? Even if your conscience wants you to do that, that's not good for your well-being. But also don't become part of the Gestapo, right? Because you don't need that to preserve your well-being, and that would be actively violating your conscience, right? There's a balance in between. And I don't think it's fair to expect people to be completely altruistic and always go with only what their conscience says or what maximizes the well-being for everyone else, even if it hurts them. I actually think that altruism in general, as an approach, is a dangerous and damaging thing, even if it might lead to something that seems good to us in the case of like a totalitarian dystopian state or whatever. Furthermore, just because my system of morality can't tell you to perhaps bombastically work against the social order, doesn't mean that it can't tell you to take some risks to change the social order or do what little you can. And furthermore, it can tell you what social order you should desire, even if you can't necessarily change the social order you're in. Because it can tell you what social order you should desire based on what social order would allow you to maximize your own well-being. And of course, a social order that would allow you to maximize your own well-being is one in which your material welfare and the welfare of your conscience were not in conflict. So, a society in which, in order where you could essentially serve the well-being of others, not harm others, and also serve your own well-being at the same time, right? So even if you are in a dystopian scenario in which you're punished for doing good things and rewarded for doing evil things, you can still morally condemn that system from within my moral system and desire another one. And so I think the reason that this seems like an objection, the fact that my moral system can't tell you perhaps to be a rebel in a dystopian system, it only seems like a problem if you are defining morality as something that's necessarily absolute and necessarily fundamentally altruistic. But I don't think any of those things are obvious assumptions that need to be true about morality. There have been many moral systems that are neither of those things and are valid moral systems nevertheless. So, one final point. I don't think that my moral system is as good as one we could hope for, right? We could hope for an absolute universal objective ethics. That would be amazing, but I just don't think that's possible. And I think my system of ethics is stronger than the alternatives. Yeah, so I hope this was an interesting video. Thank you for listening. Bye.